In our lecture today, we are going to talk about how to manage the risk and return for a portfolio. As we have mentioned before, we can define the risk as the uncertainty that the investment will earn its expected rate of return. Most investors require higher rate of return on investment if they perceive that there is any uncertainty about the expected rate of return. This increased the required risk premium, which includes the business risk, financial risk, liquidity risk, exchange rate risk, and country risk. Business risk is the uncertainty of the income flow caused by the nature of the firm's business. The financial risk is the uncertainty introduced by the methods by which the firms finance its investments. Liquidity risk is about how long it will take to convert an investment into cash and how certain is the price to be received. Exchange rate risk is the uncertainty of the return to an investor who acquires securities in currency different from his own. The country risk is also called the political risk, is the uncertainty of the return caused by the possibility of the major changes in political or the economic environment of the country. So the risk premium that's accrued by the investors include a function of business risk, financial risk, liquidity risk, exchange rate risk, and the country risk. An investor portfolio is a collection or combination of the financial assets following the concept of don't put all your eggs in one basket. If an investor holds a single asset, he or she will fully suffer the consequences of the poor performance. The return on the portfolio is a weighted average of the returns on the individual assets from which it's formed. So we can calculate it by the following equation. RP, the return on the portfolio, equal W, the proportion of the portfolio's total dollars, represented by the assets, multiply by R, which considered as the return on the assets. So the equation will be summation. If you want to calculate the portfolio return, be the summation of W multiplied by R. Assume we have two different assets, X and Y, and we want to make a portfolio called XY. If you want, by combining equal portion, 50% of assets X and Y at the same time, the expected rate of return of asset X and Y for each of the next 5 years are given in the column 1 and column 2. Asset X, as we see, the return is 8%, 10%, 12%, 14%, and 16%. For asset Y was 16%, 14%, 12%, 10%, and 8%. So by calculating the rate of return, for example, for year 2010, we will multiply 50% multiplied by 8% plus 50% multiplied by 16% equal 12%. And we'll do that for each of the following years. As we see in the last column, column 4, the rate of return will be 12% at each year. As shown in part B of the table, the expected value of these portfolio returns over the 5 years period is also 12%. In part C of the table, portfolio XY standard deviation is calculated to be 0% as well. This value shouldn't be surprising because the expected return each year is the same of 12%. So there is no variability existed in the expected returns from year to year. So if we look here, we will find that the standard deviation of this portfolio will be 0. So how the diversification can affect the stability of the asset return? Diversification is enhanced depending upon the extent to which the return on the assets move together. If we look to the next figure, we will find that return N and return for asset M perfectly matched. However, in the next figure, we will find that they perfectly negatively correlated. If we combine the two different assets, for example, asset F and asset G, the portfolio assets F and G will have a more stability expected rate of return. To illustrate the impact of the diversification on the risk and return, we have an example here. We have three different assets, asset X, Y, and Z, with expected value of 12% for each, and the standard deviation for 3.16 for each. So if we want to make a portfolio combining X and Y, the expected value for the portfolio will be 12% and the standard deviation will be 0. 0 because the asset X and Y are negatively correlated. While if you want to make a portfolio of X and Z, the expected rate of return will be 12% and the standard deviation will be 3.16. The risk or the standard deviation will increase because asset X and asset Z are positively correlated. So there is a relationship between the pattern of the return and the expected standard deviation, which represented the risk for the portfolio. If the assets are positively correlated, that means the standard deviation will be high. If the assets are negatively, the return of the assets are negatively correlated, that means the expected standard deviation will be low. So there's a relation between the pattern, the type of the pattern or the pattern of the return, and the risk of the portfolio. To measure the success of the potentially diverse portfolio, covariance and correlation are considered. A positive covariance means that the return of the two assets move together, while the negative covariance means that they move in inverse directions. The covariance can be calculated by the following equation: covariance X and Y for the portfolio X and Y, represented by the summation of the probability of X minus the expected rate X multiplied by Y minus the expected rate Y for the two investments X and Y, which included in the same portfolio. However, covariance is not an absolute measure. The covariance cannot be compared with one another. To obtain a relative measure, the formula for the correlation coefficient is required. We can calculate the correlation coefficient by dividing the covariance over the sigma, or dividing the covariance over the standard deviation for the assets included in the portfolio. Here, for example, we calculate the coefficient, the correlation coefficient, and it seems to be negative 0.48. The perfect positive correlation occurs when the return from two securities moves up and down together in proportion. Combining these two securities in portfolio would decrease the diversification effects. while perfect negative correlation takes place when one security moves up and the other one down in expected proportion. Combining these two securities in the portfolio would increase the diversification effect. The uncorrelated situation occurs when the return from two securities move independently for each other. That is, if one goes up, the other may go up or down or may not move at all. As a result, the combination of these two securities in a portfolio may or may not create the diversification effect. However, it is still better to be in this position than in the perfect positive correlation situation. Thank you for listening and hope you the best. Thanks.